Howdy, all my nieces and nephews. It's your Uncle Perry. And you know what that means. It's time for another scary ass story. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more spooky tales like this. Also, like the video and share it with other folks that like spooky shit. I appreciate it. Now, let's get creepy. There was something indescribably wrong with the Thanksgiving turkey. By Reddit user Weird Brysky. When the turkey was set on the table, my brother and I simultaneously knew that something was odd about it. My sister remained oblivious until it happened. My mom and dad were too enamored by my grandmother's newly crafted ultimate mac and cheese casserole to take notice of the odd bird placed before them. My aunt acted normal, although she hadn't seemed too excited about any dish in particular. After setting the turkey down, my grandfather took his place at the head of the table, his rightful place, since it was his house, and gestured for all of us to join hands in prayer. My brother and I kept our eyes open throughout the entirety of it. Our gazes shifted from that weird turkey to each other and to the faces of our relatives, who mouthed the words languidly spoken by our grandfather, a man of great patience, reverence for God, and little appetite. When the communal Amen was uttered, eyes flicked open and hands quested for serving utensils. Plates were raised, portions were carved, excised, and scooped. Forks descended upon dead meat, heat-blasted cheese, roasted potatoes, and steamed vegetables. Only my brother and I had stayed our hands, not wanting anything to do with the savagely hewn bird. So as not to raise suspicion, I subtly enjoined him to grab something else and sent my own hand towards the bread roll. I loaded my plate enough to where the absence of turkey would hopefully not be noticed, and he did likewise, and yet our grandfather, ever watchful, noticed our avoidance of the main dish. "Is something wrong with the meat, children? Too dry for your tastes, perhaps? Too, as you might say, lemony?" The chatter which had filled the table stopped in an instant, and all eyes turned to look at my brother and I. There were only a few rules of courtesy at our dinner table once the prayer was finished, and everyone was typically free to indulge how they would. But one thing you did not do among our family was insult the holiday cooking. If you didn't like it, you stomached it. To avoid eating the food entirely was considered a direct insult to the person who had prepared it, a nearly unforgivable culinary sin. Always quicker to the thought than my brother, I stuttered out an excuse about how I was saving the turkey for last and treating the present items on my plate as appetizers. My tongue-tied brother simply nodded in agreement and put on a stupid smile that would have made the most devout nun appear guilty of utter blasphemy. Our grandfather studied us with his hawk-like face for just a moment. The eyes quickly passed back and forth between me and my brother before clapping his hands together and applauding our preference of eating. He thanked us for giving his turkey such an anticipatory consideration, then turned to my mom and began an entirely unrelated conversation. The chatter of the table resumed, and my brother and I exchanged a glance of relief as we nibbled on our food and tried not to look at the bizarre turkey inches away from us. The minutes ticked by until half an hour had elapsed, and neither of us had touched the turkey. I'd already finished a plate and a half of the so-called appetizers, and my stomach had grown bloated from the mac and cheese casserole, which was actually very good. My brother chewed absent-mindedly at stuffing, and I had to flick a green bean at him before he unwittingly drank from a small cup of gravy. Our avoidance of the turkey was pathetically obvious at this point, but our grandfather was too absorbed in the retelling of some story from his time spent as an occult investigator to notice, which by the appearance of my glassy-eyed father was not a new one. At 40 minutes, with a sleight of hand I hadn't thought possible for her arthritic hands, my aunt slid a few slices of turkey onto my plate and did the same for my brother. The latter maneuver was extremely impressive since he sat 2 seats away from her, whereas I had been seated right beside of her. No one noticed this, but once the act was complete, she casually spoke aloud. "Well, that's the second helping I've seen you two eat. You must really like your old grandpa's turkey." Doubly bewildered, first by her surreptitiously served turkey, and secondly by the blatant falsehood, my brother and I could only offer wide eyes and awkward smiles in response. Our grandfather turned his attention away from my dad, who seemed relieved by the interruption. Glancing at our plates and then our faces, our grandfather first seemed to doubt the legitimacy of our aunt's observation. He even glanced at the turkey as if in an attempt to mentally evaluate how much had been taken and by whom. For a moment, I feared that I would just have to take a bite in order to validate my aunt's boldly spoken lie. But just as my fingers twitched towards the fork, a smile spread across Grandpa's face, and he nodded in thanks. Then, without further delay, he returned his attention to my dad, who in turn resumed that far-minded, glassy-eyed look. The change overcame my mom and sister first. My mom, as she would often awkwardly say, is a turkey-holic and has never failed to consume the most of it during Thanksgiving. My sister simply likes holiday food in general, with the time of the year being her break from the rigid diet she adheres to in college prior to the season. Together, they had ate several thick cuts of turkey, most of which had been slathered in homemade gravy. It was a lucky thing that I had stopped my brother from drinking the gravy earlier, because bits of turkey had also been used in its preparation. When my mom leaned back in her chair, moaning and rubbing her stomach, I assumed it was the natural result of turkey-begotten languor. When my sister did the same, an act uncharacteristic of her, she was ravenous, but not slovenly. I suspected that something was wrong. My dad was beginning to nod off and hadn't noticed the dual display of turkey-based debilitation. My aunt had excused herself, presumably to go to the bathroom or call her husband, who hadn't been able to attend due to his unchangeable work schedule. My grandmother had already started busying herself with cleaning up the empty dishes and trays. My grandfather, sitting still with his unfinished first plate before him, watched my mom and sister with a casual and somewhat sinister look of satisfaction. My brother noticed the unusual behavior of our sister and threw me a glance that held in it all the fraternal panic he could impress without drawing attention to himself. For some reason, we both knew with a dark certainty that it was imperative we remain calm in front of our grandfather. Something strange was occurring, something that involved the turkey. And while we hadn't an idea about what exactly that thing was, we knew that upholding the family holiday spirit was crucial to sustaining our well-being. All that adherence to calmness and furtive exchanges was thrown out the window when my sister's stomach burst open and a monstrous creature crawled from her innards and plopped itself on the dinner table. The utter shock at this unholy visceral birth silenced the scream that had threatened to escape my throat. My brother reeled back, nearly falling out of his chair. The creature, no bigger than a puppy, but abhorrently formed and covered in gore, flailed about on the table, knocking over dishes and glasses of wine. My sister appeared unfazed by the abdominal eruption and continued to recline with the same casualness as before. My mother, in a similar state, said nothing. But a moment later, her stomach bulged hideously, and something then cut its way through the straining flesh. Blood sprayed out, drenching the food on the table, and also the two youthful faces that stared in stupefied horror at the grisly genesis. The first creature gained some semblance of physical articulation and raised itself on four shaking, blood-soaked limbs. Its body was a bastardization of human and avian morphology, a twisted amalgamation of mammalian features and the finer aspects of poultry. It was at first voiceless, but an inhuman cry soon erupted from its newborn lungs, and a wailing grimmer than a post-war dirge was carried across the dinner table, chilling my blood colder than the ice cream cake on the counter. Ooh, ice cream. The potent stench of bowels conquered the aromas of the meal, filling my nostrils with nauseating fumes. Upon hearing that appalling sound, I screamed in mindless terror. My scream then rose in pitch and ferocity to match that awful beast's cry, as the second creature detached itself from its intestinally umbilical connection to my mother. This creature was slightly larger than the first, but just as abhorrent as its predecessor. My brother, shocked beyond all sense, merely cried in his seat. Finally awakening from all the ruckus, my dad turned his attention towards the carnage and shouted out something unintelligible. I turned to him, hoping he would bring some sense to the madness. A deeper, darker dread instantly befell my heart as I watched my grandfather plunge a fork into my dad's neck. The most bizarre thing of that carnal scene, my grandmother simply continued cleaning, totally ignorant of, or apathetic to, the violence and death happening around her. She brushed crumbs off the table covering, stacked dirty dishes onto one another, and refilled wine glasses, even those of people who were presently dead or dying. And all the while, my grandfather looked on those two wretched gut-born turkey spawns with a morbid glee. His lips silently mouthed indecipherable words, which I can only assume were the lyrics to some profane incantation relating to the developing atrocities. After a few moments of gurgling, my father's body fell forward onto the table, his head coming to a rest in a container of barely touched candied yams. My grandmother walked by, plucked the fork from his neck, and placed it onto the pile of dishes she carried in the other hand. I don't remember consciously unseating myself, navigating around the table and those horrible little creatures, both screaming now, and grabbing my brother, but I do remember pushing aside my grandmother and clocking my grandfather in the side of the head with a turkey leg. I, of course, dropped the turkey leg after it struck. Guiding my still-weeping brother by the hand, I fled the house, leaving those two crawling incubi and my mostly dead family behind. I practically threw my brother into the car and had regained enough sense and presence of mind to order him to buckle his seatbelt. He did as I commanded. As I pulled out of the driveway, sweaty hands barely managing to stay on the wheel, my aunt stumbled out the front door of the house with gravy and what I hoped wasn't blood smeared across her mouth. She looked terrified, and I was about to stomp on the brake and have my brother open the back seat door for her, but she screamed, "Drive away!" and threw her arms out. Before I could challenge the order and beckon her to the car, her legs buckled and she fell to her knees. A second later, an expression of unimaginable agony overrode her face, and her hands gripped her stomach. A cry unlike anything I'd ever heard erupted from her throat, and her stomach expanded in an alarming, inordinate size. I actually heard it burst. The sound was, to be gruesomely simple, wet. Her entrails splashed onto the front porch, coating the surface in blood and bile. Her awful cry was cut short, and her head fell back. From within the pile of guts stirred a monstrous yet familiar thing, and its half-human, half-bestial cry sent my body to terror-induced action. I pulled out of the driveway and sped down the street, leaving that delivery room of hell behind. By the time we had reached the highway, I suppose I had unconsciously driven us towards our own home, my brother had calmed down a bit and asked, "What happened back there?" I hadn't even the slightest idea of what to tell him, so I just said, "I don't know." And then, as if in answer to our ignorance, my phone rang. The caller was my mom, who I had just minutes ago watched give intestinal birth to some abysmal little turkey demon. Both reason and instinct told me to ignore the call, and even throw the phone out the window, but a black curiosity compelled me to answer it. By default, I have my phone set to answer calls on speakerphone, so my brother heard the subsequent sounds too. I don't think he'll ever recover from the trauma they caused. I won't spend long describing what we heard. It was the noise of a demonic chorus, the sounds of actual pandemonium. Cries and shrieks that couldn't have come from human lungs filled the car. I almost crashed the car into a guardrail as I instinctively brought my hands to my ears. I barely managed to right the steering wheel and save our lives in my repulsion at those loathsome, evil sounds. We had already traveled miles away from the diabolical sight by the time I had received the call, and yet my foot depressed the pedal even harder when I heard, beneath the screeching horrors, the deep, maniacal laughter of my grandfather. Just as I threw the phone out the window, I heard the words, "Finally, grandchildren who will come visit me for more than just the holidays." Howdy, all my nieces and nephews. It's your Uncle Perry, and you know what that means. It's time for another scary-ass story. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more cool tales. I didn't start the recording of the audio either. Stupid. I always fucking forget that. Too much shit to remember. Howdy, all my nieces. It's smacking them. It's already getting fucking hot in here. Jeez, I just started. I'll be all sweaty by the time this is over with. Fuck yeah, cool. Not wanting anything to do with the savagely Hayun bird. Hayun? I loaded my plate enough to where the absence of turkey... Doubly bewildered. First by her surreptitiously... I can't say that word. Doubly bewildered. Say that 3 times fast. Doubly bewildered. First by her surreptitiously. First by her surreptitiously. Let's try it again. Doubly bewildered. First by her surreptitiously deserved. Doubly bewildered. First by her surreptitiously deserved almost got it that time. That was just a fucking... Yeah. His lips silently mouthed indecipherable words, which I can only assume were the lyrics to some profane incantation relating to the... Fuck. Hang on a second, I lost my spot. God damn it. Fuck. My aunt stumbled out the front door. See, I'm just going to do that. That was good, man. I got a long ways on that one without fucking up. I'm getting better at this shit. Cries and shrieks that have come from... shit. God damn. I need a drink after that.